You're free.
Yeah, yeah. What up, Jack?
You're free.
Yeah. I'm free, whole dreams like a cold can of Guinness. But old man Winter got his own plans with us. And you owe that nigga if you don't own your image. Lone shot nigga, but a cold-blooded killer. That move your freedoms higher up on the shelf. Every time you make a move that's detrimental to self. And this ain't the type of debt that you can consolidate. Small principles let interest rates dominate. So when I did some shit that lowered my self-respect, his goons cold and frigid always came to collect. And when you can't pay up, they ain't breaking your arm. They run up in your peace of mind, taking your calm. So I concentrate like I'm making a bomb. Cause one false move can take you from home, and then you're not free. I am who I am, be who I wanna be, cause I'm free. You can do the same, master of your domain. You'll be
You're all
free, yeah. Cause we're free.
The race of the Egyptian has always been a hotly debated topic among historians and the general public. There is this unwritten racial dichotomy happening whenever this discussion is presented to an academic audience. Were the Egyptians black or white? The answer to this question would seem obvious simply based upon the race of a person, or more complexly, the system of belief a person would seem to subscribe to. There are many so-called white Europeans who subscribe to the belief that ancient Egyptians are indeed black or dark-skinned. Of this same dark-skinned belief of Egyptians, specifically American blacks almost wholeheartedly agree that ancient Egyptians were black. The only issue arises when we see modern depictions of ancient Egyptians as an attempt at modern whitewashing. Video after video, image after image, ancient Egyptians are increasingly illustrated lighter and lighter with predominantly European features. Interestingly enough, the only Egyptians picturized as people with dark skin were the slaves. These foundational ideas of what an ancient Egyptian was in terms of race sit at opposite ends of the supposed racial spectrum, in stark contrast from one another. The idea of a light-skinned Egyptian with European features only fits the narrative of a certain Caucasian group of people. However, in respect to the contrast in racial dialogue on this subject, are these two ideas of what race an Egyptian really was mutually exclusive to one another? The truth often does not lie within the determined spectrums of human understanding, meaning in most cases, the truth, in a human sense, is neither black nor white. So as the same goes with race. Through our westernized constructs, our understanding of race, or more accurately, the physical appearance of our general perception of earthly vessels, has been skewed and psychologically micromanaged into a color-based misconception. The shade or hue of a person's skin has nothing to do with racial identity. Just as many people think Caucasian is synonymous with white or pale skin, those very same people cannot deny the absolute fact that some of the darkest races on earth are indeed Caucasian. Skin color is not indicative of racial identity. South Asia is one of the most populous places on earth. Many of these people are predominantly of Caucasian ancestry, whose skin just so happens to be darker than the majority of so-called Negroes across the Americas. The modern Egyptian is predominantly of European ancestry, while sub-Saharan ancestry only accounts for a very small percentage of the heritage of the modern Egyptian, as well as the North African in general. The argument behind the racial identity of an ancient Egyptian lies at the heart of the world historical narrative. Often the spoils of war have a far more conspiratorial nature of the abyss of future judgment. The day has come upon us as a testament to our wisdom, the ability to peer through the veil and strike down anyone who attempts to confound the truth.
On the south lay the teeming world of black Africa as it does today. It was separated from the great white race by the broad stretch of the Sahara Desert. Sometimes the blacks of inner Africa did wander along the Nile Valley road to Egypt, but they came only in small groups. Thus, cut off by the desert barrier and living by themselves, they remained uninfluenced by civilization from the north. The Negro peoples of Africa were therefore without any influence on the development of early civilization." End quote. Drawing on decades of painstaking craniometry or craniology, the measurement of skulls, this diagram breaks Breasted's great white race into three subgroups. Number one, the Nordics of the northern flatlands, with long-headed, tall, blue-eyed, and blonde. Number two, round-headed alpines of Central Europe's highlands. And number three, long-headed Mediterraneans, whose southern branch included ancient Egyptians. The note under the diagram concedes without elaboration that, quote, south of the Mediterranean, the people of the great white race are darker skinned than elsewhere, end quote. Breasted's 1935 edition did protest that the popular term Aryan should be applied only to the Indian and Iranian branch of Indo-Europeans, but it also hailed, quote, the eventual triumph of Greece and Rome in the Near East as evidence that the Indo-European branch of the white race triumphed over the southern Semitic branch, the complete triumph of our ancestors, end quote. This not only conflated the Indo-European and Semitic language groups with race, but also implied the rejection of Semites, which in the US of the 1930s primarily meant Jews, as part of his American we or us. Even so, for his day, Breasted was relatively moderate on race compared to some of his scholarly predecessors and contemporaries. In the years leading up to the Civil War and the founding of the Peabody Museum, the American Ethnological School of Samuel Morton, Josiah Nott, and George Glidden claimed that science proved that races had not changed since ancient times, whites were biologically superior, and that ancient Egyptians were white, but as in the southern US, had blacks as slaves and servants. Nott and Glidden's 1854 Types of Mankind declared of Ramses II, quote, his features are as superbly European as Napoleon's, whom he resembles. Then they showed this pharaonic captive with collar and cord, labeling it Negro, 3,200 years old. Flinders Petrie, Breasted's contemporary, was an ardent eugenicist who attributed Egypt's civilization to an invading superior race, white, of course. Clarence Fisher, in a labor dispute with his mentor, George Reisner, assumed that modern Egyptians were black and thus not to be trusted. Quote, Dr. Reisner's present attitude is an acknowledgement that he regards the word of a native black man as to be more relied on than that of two white men, such as Mr. Sanborn and myself, the representatives of a sister university, end quote. To Reisner, Fisher wrote, quote, it is usually accepted that the word of a white man is better than that of a native, but I am sorry to say that several times during the past 2 years you have thought it best to think otherwise. If you intend to support Mahmoud el-Mayyit, it is intended as an insult not only to us personally, but to the University of Pennsylvania. It will certainly destroy any other white man's authority over these people, end quote.
When seeking to understand the racial identity of an Egyptian, most people think in the context of modern racial socio-archetypes, most commonly black and white. To truly get a scope on the complexity of this question is not to just understand that skin color is not an end-all be-all identifier when it comes to race, but that geographic isolation and sexual selection play the most important roles concerning the appearance of the races. Although the singular, most widely accepted migration theory promoted by modern scientists is indeed unproven and completely void of archaeological and anthropological evidence, these institutions of higher learning continue to press on into the eternal sea of descending ignorance, sketched and designed into the limited confines of human understanding. As stated earlier, the entirety of our understanding of ancient Egyptians does not come to us from the Egyptians themselves who dwelt in modern Egypt, but annals of world history. Shall we compare and contrast the influence that each supposed transfer of lands has affected the overall history of the world? If we were to compare the actual proven archaeological evidence of the Nile Valley in terms of history and population over the last 500 years to that of the Mississippi, is there really any comparison? If we would double that time frame and extend to the last 1,000 to 2,000 years, whose history is still more significant? It has been archaeologically proven that Aboriginal societies in the Americas dwarfed the most renowned European cities like Rome, Athens, and Alexandria, Egypt. Remember, while Egyptian artifacts were being preserved, Mississippian mound artifacts were being stolen and destroyed. Why such the contrast in the handling of past history? The same institutions who want us to believe implicit in the deception. Why would people choose to destroy the history of Middle America to the point that the most recognized institution of American national history, the Smithsonian, denies the entire existence of civilizations who lived in America less than 400 years ago, while at the very same time promoting other civilization? As mentioned earlier, many of the most ancient cities in pre-Columbian America were not only destroyed, but also built upon. And indeed, the largest cities on the continent are reconstructed upon ancient ruins. This is not new information to the Freemasons and Jesuits, as documented and written in several publications prior to the year 1800, long before ancient Egypt was even known to a people only a 3-day trip across the Mediterranean. The way we look at race or ethnicity is intrinsically westernized. Everything we have been told about other people has been assembled within the box of the conqueror's narrative, at the cost of truth, for the purposes of control by a spell cast through deception.
Vignette 4, Sons of the Pharaohs, Modern Egyptians' Perceptions of Race and Ancient Egypt. My title here is derived from this century-old book. For most Egyptians, asking if Egyptians are or were black or white is a non-starter. Religion has been far more critical than race in their debates about pharaonic heritage. In the Quran, as in the Bible, Moses defies a tyrannical pagan pharaoh to lead believers in the one true God in their exodus from Egypt. This book cover, Pharaoh in the Quran, depicts the tyrant as aghast at the miracle of turning Aaron's staff into a serpent. Here, the Quranic quotation, "Lo, Pharaoh aggrandized himself on earth," accompanies apocalyptic lightning over the pyramids, archetypical symbols of ancient Egypt. For some Muslims, paganism poisons all pre-Islamic antiquity, and denouncing any ruler as Pharaoh is the ultimate insult. Most Egyptians, however, take pride in the pharaonic civilization that dazzled the world. Similarly, African Americans under slavery and then under Jim Crow were torn between identifying with Hebrew bondage in Egypt, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go, and the lure of Egypt as a land of wisdom and wonders with which they felt an African kinship.
I walk across hot coals to show you my feet so you know I got soul. Top choice, underground rapper with the pop voice. They are not ready, they sweating, they not poised. I'm built for this, like pyramids. This is the shit kids put on their Christmas list. Everybody told me stay in my lane when they never took a trip to the place where I came from. Never saw the trees that my ancestors swang from. Never tried to understand where we got our slang from. Never felt the breeze of the slave master's whip.
To answer the question, was the ancient Egyptian black or white, leads to a much deeper question about race in general. And generalization equals ignorance when this topic is investigated thoroughly. We all know for a fact that white and black are literally just adjectives in the English language and are not indicative of racial specifications, but rather socially constructed boxes of generalization. What is a white person? Many people would venture to associate the term synonymously with European or maybe even Caucasian, but white does not mean either. In America, white is an identity, but as part of our socially manufactured doctrine of race. Yet in Europe, for example, the word white would indeed be a blanket generalization of a great segment of the population. It is doubtful that a Frenchman, a Swede, a German, a Spaniard, and a Russian would be so willing to share the same identity if it did not benefit them as a power mechanism. The same can be said for the term white in America, an ambiguous word that includes groups from Eastern Europeans to light-skinned Latinos. As well as the same for the term black, a blanket term applied to anyone with dark skin and Negro features. Either instance, a complete misrepresentation of race and culture. But no two things are as much tied together as race and culture when it comes to the identification of a people's history. Even as people migrate or become conquered over time, the traditions of the past usually follow the groups related to those customs. Of those external traditions, one of the most compelling aspects would have to be language, and physically would have to be genetics. Although nationality plays a key role in determining subgroups, a careful analysis of genetics is a viable method of classifying population groups. For the purposes of this discussion, we will be highlighting racial groups in and around Egypt, targeting genetics, language, and recent history. The modern Egyptian is primarily of the Arab culture and stock, and these people mostly speak an Arab language, which is considered part of the Afro-Asiatic language family. The Egyptian language was an Afro-Asiatic language spoken in ancient Egypt. Its attestation stretches for an extremely long time, from the Old Egyptian stage, mid-4th millennium BC, Old Kingdom of Egypt. Its earliest known complete written sentence was dated about 2690 BC, which makes it one of the oldest recorded languages known along with Sumerian. Its classical form is known as Middle Egyptian, the vernacular of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, which remained the literary language of Egypt until the Roman period. The spoken language had evolved into Demotic by the time of classical antiquity, and finally into Coptic by the time of Christianization. Spoken Coptic was almost extinct by the 17th century, but remains in use as the liturgical language of the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria. End quote. Although these classifications remain incumbent upon the academically accepted category of the Proto-Afro-Asiatic language family, this language family has been a hotly debated topic among linguists for years, and it must be noted, the conclusions promoted by linguists do not directly account for genetics or anthropology, but does directly correlate with the out of Africa theory.
And our conclusion, and this is wrapping up what I have to say, was that our proposal, not a conclusion, but our hypothesis, our proposal, was that the languages of the world today belong to just two deep time macro families. Khoisan, what we proposed is that Khoisan is the last remaining representative today of one of those macro families. This was the macro family that spread across the southern parts of Africa. Its language retained cliques. The rest of the languages of the world belong to another big macro family. All the rest of the languages. The ancestral language of this family lost cliques. That gave us a parsimonious explanation, one period in history with the loss of cliques. And here's a representation for you of a family tree. You see a sort of southern half of Africa set of language families, all extinct except for Khoisan, the left. A north distributed African family, all the rest of the world, the other three African families, and all the rest of the languages of the world belonging to that family. Well, leads us to our closing thought. There are some significant parallels here, because the division of human languages, if this hypothesis turns out to be correct, we have a southern half of Africa with basic big division within humankind, and then the rest of humankind from northern Africa outward. This looks a bit like some recent ideas of where the deepest lines of genetic connection within the human genetic ancestry are located, the same kind of division. And so I leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Quote from African Intellectual Heritage, a book of sources. Quote, "It is obvious that Semitic, Egyptian, and Berber are not genetically linked. The common pre-dialectical ancestors that some want to impose upon these groups of attested languages was never reconstructed. Hamido-Semitic and Afro-Asiatic is only a fantasy, not a linguistic reconstruction from facts of attested languages. Hamido-Semitic and Afro-Asiatic is only a simple scientific hoax, which unfortunately still persists, since Hinks, Benfey, Cohen, and Greenberg persisted with this scientific hoax. The Afro-Asiatic Journal, edited by Robert Hetzron and Russell Skoo, is one more hoax. The studies published by this journal are more detailed studies connected with such particular linguistic systems, but never with comparative studies. The Hamido-Semitic or Afro-Asiatic reminds us of another famous scientific swindle, but this time in archaeology, the bogus discovery of the alleged remains of prehistoric man, Piltdown Man, in 1912. End quote.
So it's a great pleasure to welcome Kevin MacDonald, who's Professor of African Archaeology at UCL, and you specialise particularly in West Africa.
That's right.
But this image is completely wrong, because for example, what was West Africa like where you know about, say, 2,000 years ago?
Well, about 2,000 years ago, we already were beginning to have the first urban centers in West Africa.
So towns?
Towns.
No,
towns.
so these weren't hunter-gatherer people?
No, these were
villagized.
cities of 10, 20,000 people in the early first millennium AD. And if we go back before that, into an area which is now the Mauritanian desert, there was a state contemporary with Kerma in the Nile Valley over in Sudan, in Mauritania, called Tichit, or at least it's in a region known as Tichit. We're not really sure what it called itself. But there we have a very sophisticated social formation with hundreds of settlements and some things that would certainly be the size of towns by 1200 BC.
Wow. And an alphabet?
No. Literacy for West Africa came with Islam.
As we can clearly see, the veil of Eurocentrism is draped over the entire history of Africa. Even the most Afrocentric-minded professional academics who have claimed to uncover civilizations in Africa thousands of years old will still claim that these people were illiterate all the way up into the creation of Islam. And only with Islam came literacy during the mid-600s and 700s of the Common Era. As many historians know, the Islamic religion is unquestionably tied to the early Roman Catholic Church, who saw its inception during the early 600s come together under the guidance of Benedictine monks. Indeed, many territories in this area one may currently associate with Islam were, in reality, heavily occupied by the Byzantine Empire, who practiced Eastern Orthodox Christianity. In fact, the Byzantine Empire didn't officially fall to the Ottoman Empire until the year 1453, which ironically is only 1 year after the Pope signed Dum Diversis. The Byzantine Empire, also referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantium, was the continuation of the Roman Empire or its eastern provinces during late antiquity and the Middle Ages, when its capital city was Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, formerly Byzantium. It survived the fragmentation and fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD and continued to exist for an additional 1,000 years until it fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453. During most of its existence, the empire was the most powerful economic, cultural, and military force in Europe. Byzantine Empire is a term created after the end of the realm. Its citizens continue to refer to their empire as the Roman Empire and themselves as Romans. End quote. The primary issue with the current system of linguistic classification is that the complete history of world languages must fit into this limited generalization. Furthermore, the foundative methodology of westernized linguistic studies is built upon two simple yet unsubstantiated ideas. 1. That all world languages must fit the proposed theoretical models that align closely with the out of Africa and Darwin model. 2. That the Shemitic Afro-Asiatic languages of Northern Africa are completely unconnected to the languages of sub-Saharan Africa. According to most linguistic models, the Proto-Afro-Asiatic language family's origins can be traced to the regional borders of modern-day Eritrea and Sudan, an area associated with ancient Nubia, a kingdom that's located just south of Egypt. The regional language classification is titled Erythraean, which is a Greek maritime designation for the area around the northeastern coast of the continent. The separately designated bodies of water, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea, were once labeled a single body of water, the Erythraean Sea. This Erythraean tongue is said to have diverged into several languages in North Africa. As maintained by the top linguists, the Erythraean tongue diverged initially into the Omotic language spoken in Ethiopia, and this is the last point of world linguistics that can be completely agreed upon as it concerns the Afro-Asiatic language. However, there is a general consensus in terms of progression of the language, northerly up the Nile and then west across the northern coast and across the Sahara, as well as easterly into the Arabian Peninsula, diverging into the family coined by Europeans as the Shemitic language family. Most of these African linguistic classifications come from the works of Joseph H. Greenberg, an American anthropologist and linguist who specialized in African languages. Quote from Encyclopedia Britannica: having studied with Franz Boas at Columbia University, Greenberg earned a PhD in anthropology in 1940 from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where he studied with Melville Herskovitz. He served in the U.S. Army from 1940 to 1945 and then taught at the University of Minnesota and Columbia University before becoming a professor of anthropology at Stanford. While teaching at Columbia, Greenberg published studies in African linguistic classification. From the time of its publication, the work has been controversial. Some linguists consider it the most influential study on African languages, while others find Greenberg's work to be only a modification of the earlier classification scheme of Dietrich Westermann. Originally, Greenberg posited 16 families of African languages. In the revised edition, he presented only 4: the Niger-Congo, the Afro-Asiatic, the Nilo-Saharan, and the Khoisan, each of which is further subdivided. Greenberg claimed to have arrived at this conclusion by use of mass comparison, a somewhat dubious method he developed that uses similarities in vocabularies among languages to show genetic relation. This method is often criticized for building hypotheses without real evidence. Subsequent discoveries have refined some of his internal divisions, though most of his conclusions are generally accepted. End quote. So one thing I found very interesting when I was, just researching, I first wanted to research Joseph H. Greenberg to see a little bit more about him, just to see, who the guy is. So, the first place most people go is Wikipedia. So the first thing I do is I always like to see where people are from. So I always go to early life. So the first thing I noticed, Joseph Greenberg was born on May 28th, 1915 to Jewish parents. Okay. So then I just decide to go to Franz Boas. So I go to Franz Boas. Franz Boas was born on July 9th, 1858 in Minden, Westphalia, son of Sophie Meyer and Meyer Boas. Although his grandparents were observant Jews, okay, we see who Franz Boas is. And then finally, let's just go to Melville J. Herskovits, renowned anthropologist and founder of all Afrocentrism. Born in Antipolo City to Jewish immigrants in Bellefontaine, Ohio in 1895. So there is one common denominator here, and we know what that denominator is without even really having to articulate that point any further. As we can see, attempts are consistently underway to suppress the so-called Negro influence in not just ancient Egypt, but the overall language as well. Most of these findings contradict simple genetic analysis. How could a geographically proximate, genetically older, yet less diverged people's language be completely unrelated to someone whom they are actually blood related to? The genetics tell another story that linguistics cannot conceal. Just as the Nubian 25th dynasty was purposely left off the listing of rulers at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, when Libyans, Persians, and Greeks, all considered non-Negro, were included. This is a blanket example of whitewashing history by exclusion.
Several centuries has wandered in the desert, it is because this shamanic function has been either suppressed or forgotten, and different images of the artist have been held up at different times. The artist as artifact, the artist as handmaiden of a ruling class of family, the artist as...
Again, these supposed rulers or pharaohs cannot be substantiated through archaeology or anthropology, but rather through interpretive methods of deciphering hieroglyphics only known to the world after the discoveries made by the French. These linguists want us to believe that even the simple math used in ancient Egypt was completely foreign to the people who had been ignorantly dwelling under the shadows of the Great Pyramid for over 1,000 years. Yet within a few this contradiction in philosophies is tantamount to hypocrisy and further highlights the untrustworthiness of all institutions of higher learning, as evident in several examples. The figureheads of higher academia are well-trained liars and the gatekeepers for some of the most evil people on earth. How do we begin to stop the spread of false knowledge? How does one prove that America is Egypt? Too many questions, not enough time. To be continued on the next episode of America is Egypt.
Free. You can do the same, master of your domain. You're free. Oh, even if you don't know, realize it right quick, man. No longer a wannabe, just the ends. I done made it back to Kansas with the help of the whiz. Dumb if you think love ain't the answer that cancels your cancer. While this fear is the anvil drop to make you scramble around in no direction. Sheep without a shepherd. Run around scared, looking for protection from the wolf that's licking his chops, sitting on his hunches, hiding in the bushes, visualizing what his lunch is. Realize it's one sky that we united under when the wolf caught the bullet from the rifle of the hunter. Blast from the barrel, relieve brain from its function, but my spirit's strong enough to walk away from it. The greatest trick they ever pulled was thinking that you gotta live by someone else's rules, and we believed it like fools. Step back, ask yourself if you're a tool getting used to build a library that ain't part of your school. If you do, take control back, make the mold crack, yank your tail out the trap and blast like nigga whole lack. Cause you're free now, even though this ain't a freestyle. We still free. How's it feel? How's it feel? You can do the same, master of your domain. You're free. Free.